Somewhere under the sand in northern Sudan, a bronze head of the Roman Emperor Augustus was buried face down beneath the bottom step of a temple. Hacked off a statue, placed deliberately so that everyone who climbed those steps put a sandal on the face of the most powerful man alive. Somebody won that badly and wanted it remembered. 400 years later, the kingdom that buried it was finished, and nobody can tell you why. The standard answer is an army from the highlands. But the king who gets the credit left a long inscription about that campaign, and Kush is not what it says he destroyed. 3 things have come out of the ground since. Teeth from 13 desert cemeteries that recorded the weather. Dust in the bone of people's faces. And a script we can read aloud, correctly, and cannot understand. Stay with me for that last one. In 30 BCE, Rome annexed Egypt. The kingdom sitting on the southern side of that new border had been there for 2,500 years already, and it now had a neighbor that had never lost a war it intended to win. Most of the ancient world responded to an arrangement like that by paying. Kush responded by going north instead. Around 25 BCE, Kushite forces crossed into Roman territory and struck the frontier towns above the First Cataract, around Aswan. They took prisoners, they took plunder, and they took the statues, which is the detail that survives, because the Roman geographer Strabo was writing about this within living memory. Bronze portraits of the emperor had been set up along that border for the reason such things are always set up, to make it clear to anyone looking south who the ground now belonged to. The campaign is associated with a queen the Greek sources call Candace, which was not a name but a title. The woman behind it is generally identified as Amanirenas. Rome sent an army south in response, and it went badly for Kush on the ground. What happened next is the part that matters. Kushite envoys traveled to negotiate directly with Augustus, and they came away with terms. The tribute question was dropped. A frontier was agreed. Strabo says the emperor granted them everything they asked for. Rome, which did not normally do this, settled. And one of those heads went home. Somebody carried it several hundred miles up the Nile to the capital at Meroe, to a small single-room temple that archaeologists now label M292, and buried it under the steps. Face down, not hidden, not melted down. Placed exactly where the weight of every person entering that building would come down on it. Consider the decision itself. Bronze at that date was money. 17 kilos of it could have been weighed, cut, and turned into tools or coin by any smith in the city. Somebody looked at that and chose instead to put it in the ground, permanently, where it would do nothing except be stepped on. That is not looting. That is a statement, and it was meant to last. It stayed there for 1,900 years. In December of 1910, a team led by John Garstang of Liverpool University was cutting into that mound and came down on it at about 2.5 meters, 46 centimeters tall, the neck broken clean where it had been struck from the body, and the eyes were still in it. Inlaid glass for the pupils, calcite for the irises, set by a Roman workshop and untouched since. Lord Kitchener, who happened to be touring Sudan, came out to the dig to look at it himself. It is in the British Museum now. That head is almost always presented as a story about Rome, one of the finest surviving likenesses of Augustus, preserved by a lucky accident of climate. Read it the other way, and it is not about Rome at all. It is a receipt. A kingdom in what is now Sudan fought the largest military power on earth to a negotiated settlement, took its emperor's face home as an object, and then spent the next 4 centuries walking on it. That is not the behavior of a marginal state. That is a power that had already handled Egypt, already handled Assyria, and now had Rome's signature on a document, which sets a problem for everything that follows. Whatever ended this kingdom, and it did end, was not simply somebody stronger arriving. Stronger had already arrived. Stronger had come up the Nile with legions and gone home with terms it did not like. If you are looking for the thing that took Kush apart, you are not looking for an army. You are looking for something that could do what Rome could not, and do it so slowly that nobody living through it thought to write it down. We found it eventually, and it was not in any inscription. It was in a tooth. Enamel forms in childhood and then never changes again, which means every person buried along that river is carrying a sealed record of the weather they grew up in. Read enough of them, and a pattern comes out that nobody wrote down and nobody intended. Generation after generation, these people quietly stopped growing wheat and started growing sorghum. I will show you exactly what that means shortly, and it is the most damning thing in this entire story. But first, you need to know what the arrangement actually was and who else had already tried to break it. Around 1500 BCE, Egypt came south and took Kush. Not a raid. An occupation, and it lasted roughly 4 centuries. Egypt installed its language, its architecture, its administration, and its gods. What it did not do was erase what was already there. Kerma, the old Kushite capital, had been standing for more than 1,000 years before Egypt ever arrived, and what lay underneath the Egyptian layer survived the entire occupation. That single fact explains almost everything that happens next, because by the 700s BCE, the arrangement had reversed. Egypt fragmented into competing local kingdoms with shifting alliances, and a Kushite king named Paye looked north at the country that had once owned him and saw an opening. He took his fleet up the Nile with horsemen and archers on the flanks and laid siege to the city of Hermopolis. His men built ramps and assault towers against the walls, and when the city finally broke, its ruler did not send his officials out to surrender. He sent his wives and daughters, and they went to negotiate not with Paye, but with the royal women of the Kushite household. That was a deliberate choice, and it worked, because those women held genuine authority over succession and over military affairs. They were called the Kandaki. Greek writers turned that word into a personal name and got it wrong for 2,000 years. Then Paye walked into the conquered city, and the thing he chose to lose his temper about was the horses. The stables had been neglected during the siege. Of everything in a city he had just spent months breaking, the state of the animals is what he put on record. From there he took Memphis, the Egyptian capital, and then he did something no conqueror is supposed to do. He installed his sister Amenertis in the priesthood at Thebes, left officials behind to run the place, and went home to live in Kush. He had just taken Egypt, and he did not want to live in it. His successors pushed control all the way to the delta, and then the Assyrians came west and kept coming, campaign after campaign, until Kushite power was pushed out of Egypt entirely in the 600s BCE, which should have been the end of it. It was not. Kush went home and kept going for another 1,000 years. They moved the center of gravity south to Meroe, and what they built there was not a copy of anything. Temples to Apetamak, a lion deity with no Egyptian equivalent, worshipped in the Kushite south and nowhere else. New cities out in the savanna below the desert. Iron worked on a scale that left slag heaps still visible today. And hafirs, which are the detail I want you to hold on to. A hafir is a basin cut into the ground to catch and hold water after the rains. It is a large hole that does nothing for months. You dig one for water you will not need until next year, and you maintain it for water your children will need the year after that. Nobody digs a hafir who is not planning to still be standing there in a generation. That is the arrangement. Strip away the pyramids and the iron and the treaty with Rome, and every century of this runs on exactly the same bargain. The river rises, the fields take the water, the surplus feeds a court, an army, a priesthood, and the men who cut the stone. Everything Kush ever achieved was purchased with margin, and the margin came from the river keeping its side of the deal. So this was not a delicate thing. It broke Egypt. It survived Assyria. It made Rome sign. It had a written language, an industrial base, a functioning succession, and reservoirs dug for grandchildren. Which leaves a question nobody could answer for 100 years, because the answer was never going to be written down by anyone. Nobody records the year the harvest was slightly worse than usual. Nobody carves that into a temple wall. 90 seconds from now, 13 cemeteries are going to answer it anyway. So go back to the tooth. because a tooth is a weather station that stopped recording. Enamel forms in childhood and then it is finished. It does not remodel, it does not repair, it does not update. Whatever chemistry was in the water you drank and the food you ate while that tooth was forming gets locked into it and stays there. Bury the person at 80 and you are still reading the weather from when they were 9. Every one of us is walking around with a sealed record of our own childhood climate in our jaw, and so was everybody who ever lived along that river. In December of 2023, a study appeared in the journal Antiquity that did exactly that. Iwona Kozieracka-Ogunmakin of the University of Exeter and the Polish Center of Mediterranean Archaeology, working with Arkadiusz Soltysiak of the University of Warsaw. 64 enamel samples taken from 56 individuals, drawn from 13 cemeteries strung along the Nile. 10 of those sites had only recently been dug out of the desert. And the project that funded the work was not named anything vague. It was called Environmental Changes and the Collapse of the Kingdom of Meroe. They knew exactly what they were looking for. They measured 2 things. The first was oxygen. Oxygen in drinking water carries a signature that shifts with rainfall and with evaporation. More heat and less rain, and the signature climbs. Across these samples, it climbs. It is modest through the early period, and then through the late Meroitic and into the centuries afterward, it rises and does not come back down. The river that the entire arrangement depended on was carrying less water, and the people drinking it recorded that in their teeth without ever knowing they were doing it. The second measurement was carbon, and this is the one that should stop you. Different crops leave different carbon signatures. Wheat and barley leave one. Sorghum and millet leave another. And across these samples, the signature moves steadily, generation after generation, away from wheat and towards sorghum. Say what that actually means in plain terms. Wheat is a crop for a place with water. Sorghum is a crop for a place without it. What the teeth are recording is thousands of ordinary households, spread over decades, each quietly deciding to plant the thing that would survive rather than the thing they preferred. There is no decree behind this. No king announced it. No inscription commemorates it. It is the sum of a very large number of individually sensible decisions made by people who were simply trying to get through next year, and the sum of those decisions is a civilization renegotiating its terms downward without ever holding a meeting about it. The animals say the same thing from a different direction. Livestock from the period after the kingdom's end carry higher values than the humans buried alongside them, which means the herds were being grazed away from the river, out in dry scrub. And the cattle split into 2 distinct groups, which reads as 2 separate herding strategies running at the same time. The narrow strip of good ground beside the water was being reserved for growing food for people. The animals went out into the dust, now the part that most channels would leave out. This is 56 people. It is a shift measured in tiny fractions of a single part per thousand, extracted from a sample that would fit in one room. It is not a photograph of a famine, and the authors do not present it as one. Read their own conclusion, and they say the environmental change may have contributed, and that it likely acted as a catalyst for a political transformation. They are careful, and they are right to be. But understand what changed here anyway. For a century, everybody arguing about why Kush fell was arguing about politics, trade, and armies, because those were the only things anybody could point at. The environment was a hypothesis with nothing underneath it. Now it has numbers, and the numbers do not come from a chronicle written by a king with a reputation to protect. They come from the bodies of farmers who never expected to be read, and every one of them points the same direction. Still, a shift in the chemistry of a tooth is an abstraction. It is a decimal point on a chart. What I want to show you next is the same change written somewhere much harder to look at, and you will not need a laboratory to see it. It is in their faces. Behind each of your cheekbones is a hollow space. It is called the maxillary sinus, and it is lined with soft tissue that reacts to whatever you are breathing. Irritate that lining long enough, and the bone underneath responds by laying down new growth on the inside of the cavity. Once that happens, it is permanent. It survives burial, it survives the soft tissue rotting away, and it is still legible on the inside of a skull thousands of years later. Which means it is possible to open a museum drawer in London and find out what somebody in Sudan was breathing in the 4th century. That is what Anna Davies Barrett did, working with Charlotte Roberts of Durham University and Daniel Antoine of the British Museum. They published the results in the International Journal of Paleopathology in 2021. 481 skeletons, 13 sites along the Middle Nile, a span running from the Neolithic all the way through to the medieval period, roughly 6,500 years of people, all of it curated in one institution. She recorded the bony changes inside those sinuses according to established criteria, and then compared the rates across time. The lowest prevalence sits with the earliest group, the hunter-gatherers and first farmers. It rises through the later periods, and the highest rates of all belong to the urban populations, the people living packed into towns. Her reading of it is careful, and it is worth stating exactly as she framed it. The causes of chronic sinusitis are numerous, and they tangle together. Tooth infections cause it, smoke from cooking fires causes it, crowding and poor sanitation cause it. But the results indicate that increasing aridity in Sudan in the later periods, combined with the intensification of farming, played a role in driving the disease upward. Now put the two studies side by side. The teeth say the air and the water were getting drier. The skulls say the people were breathing it. Two completely different methods, two completely different sets of remains, two separate research teams working on two separate questions. One conclusion. And this is where the collapse of Kush stops being an abstraction about rainfall and becomes something you can actually picture. Not a catastrophe. Not a year the sky went dark. Just a slow thickening of dust in the air of ordinary rooms, and people getting up in the morning with their heads full and their faces aching, in numbers that climbed across generations. Because that is what aridity does to a state like this. It does not empty a city in a season. It squeezes margin. The Hafirs need more digging than they used to. The fields creep closer to the water because the outer ones stopped paying. Herders and farmers find themselves wanting the same shrinking strip of ground and start having the arguments that people have when there is not enough. The settlements cluster tighter, which is exactly what puts more people in more dust and less space. And the surplus that paid for the pyramids and the priesthood and the standing army and the men who cut the stone gets thinner every single generation. Nobody living through it experiences it as a disaster. Nobody has to. A man born in a difficult decade thinks difficult is normal because it is the only thing he has ever seen. His grandfather could have told him otherwise, and his grandfather is dead. Collapse is not an event. It is a slope that outlives the people standing on it. And there was a second pressure working at the same time, which is worth naming because it is not environmental at all. Derek Welsby, of the British Museum, has made the point directly. The Kushite rulers had grown rich on trade, and over these same centuries, a number of the routes that had made them rich began bypassing the Nile Valley entirely, running instead through territory that was not theirs and paid them nothing. So the river was giving less, and the traffic was going somewhere else. The margin was being cut from both ends at once, by processes no king could see, no army could stop, and no inscription ever recorded. Which brings us to the army, because every account of this ends the same way. An invasion out of the highlands in the 4th century, a capital sacked, a kingdom finished. And there is a stone monument that describes that campaign in the conqueror's own words, in 3 separate ripts. I have read the translation. It does not say what everybody says it says. Here is the version you will find in almost every book, every documentary, every summary written in the last century. Around 350 CE, a king of Aksum, the rising power in the Ethiopian highlands, came down into the Nile Valley, sacked Meroe, and ended the kingdom of Kush. His name was Ezana. That is the ending. It has been the ending for 100 years. The evidence for it is a stone. Ezana left inscriptions carved in parallel in 3 scripts, in Ge'ez, in Greek, and in South Arabian characters, and they are genuinely among the great multilingual documents of the ancient world. It is a real monument. It is a real campaign. The text has been translated, so read the text. He goes out, he says, against the Noba. He gives the numbers. He killed 758 people, which he then itemizes as 602 men and 156 women and children. He took 629 captive. And then he turns to what he brought home. 10,560 camels, 23,900 oxen, 51,050 sheep and goats. A king who has just destroyed the oldest kingdom in Africa does not lead with sheep. That is not a description of a civilization being extinguished. That is a cattle raid, recorded in the manner of a cattle raid by a man counting livestock, because livestock is what he came back with. And the people he says he fought were the Noba, who were not the Kushites. By his own account, they were a separate group who were already sitting on that ground. George Hatke worked through the whole corpus of these inscriptions in a study published by the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World in 2013, and his reconstruction separates what has been collapsed into a single event. There were two campaigns, not one. The earlier one was waged under a different king, Usanas, and it does appear to have reached Meroe, because two Greek inscriptions bearing his titles were found at the site itself. The later campaign, the famous one, the one under Ezana, was aimed at the Noba, who were threatening Aksum's own western frontier. The second is the one everybody quotes for the destruction of Kush, and it is the one that is about somebody else. Michael Zach, of the University of Vienna, pushes it further. His argument is that the Meroitic kingdom did not end with Ezana's campaign at all, and that both the archaeological and the epigraphic material show it continuing for several decades afterward in a reduced and subordinate form. On that reading, the sack is not the death of the state. It is a change in who the state answers to. Now the case against all of this, because it is serious, and it is made by serious people. The geography in these inscriptions is genuinely disputed. Ezana's text sends troops against a place he calls Alwa, and the identification of Alwa with Meroe has never been settled. Some specialists still read the stele as marking the end of Kush, and they have good reasons for doing so. Others have argued that the whole theater of operations was in the highlands rather than the Nile Valley at all. Nobody has closed this, and anybody who tells you the Aksumite question is resolved is overstating what a small number of damaged inscriptions can carry. But look at the shape underneath it, because the shape survives every version. Take the most aggressive possible reading. Say, Ezana did march into Meroe and burn it. He is still arriving at a capital where, for a century and a half already, the farmers had been abandoning wheat for sorghum, where the herds had been pushed out into dry scrub, where the sinuses of the townspeople were filling with dust, where the trade routes had been draining away into territory the kings did not control. You do not get to sack a functioning state and then discover that its population had quietly renegotiated its entire agricultural basis decades before you turned up. Those are not the conditions of a kingdom that was destroyed. They are the conditions of a kingdom that had already stopped being able to afford itself. The invasion is a date, it is not a cause. The Aksumites did not kill Kush, they filed the paperwork. So the army is not the answer, and the teeth are only half of one. There is one more place to look, because the Kushites wrote all of this down themselves, in their own script, on their own tombs. We can read every letter of it. That is not the same thing as being able to read it. By the 3rd century BCE, Kush had stopped writing in Egyptian and started writing in its own script. 2 of them, in fact. A cursive hand for everyday use, and a monumental one built from Egyptian hieroglyphic signs, with a one-to-one correspondence between the two, so that anything written in one could be transferred directly into the other. The system itself is elegant and small. 16 basic signs, each carrying a consonant with a default vowel. 3 modifiers to change that vowel, 4 extra signs for syllables common enough to be worth their own character. And between the groups of words, a divider made of 2 or 3 dots. That is the whole apparatus. A scribe could learn it in a season. Francis Llewellyn Griffith cracked it between 1907 and 1911, working from a stand carrying the names of Meroitic rulers written in both Meroitic and Egyptian hieroglyphs. Once he had the royal names, the rest of the signs followed. Since then, anybody with a fortnight's training can stand in front of a Kushite tomb and sound out the inscription correctly, and we still do not know what most of it says. Over 2,000 Meroitic texts survive. We can pronounce them. We can transliterate every character with confidence. We cannot understand them. There is no bilingual key. No Rosetta Stone for Meroitic has ever been found, and without one, the vocabulary has had to be reconstructed word by painful word across a century, mostly from names, titles, and loanwords borrowed out of Egyptian. Sit with that for a moment, because it is not a small thing. This is a civilization that produced 2,000 documents about itself. Funerary texts, royal inscriptions, administrative notes on pottery. The people who fell are the ones who left the record, and the record is standing right in front of us, fully legible and completely silent. Claude Rilly is the reason that has started to change. A researcher at the CNRS in France, and later the holder of the chair in Meroitic Language and Civilization at the École Pratique des Hautes Études, he settled in his doctoral thesis in 2003 a question that had been argued for over 100 years. He established where the language actually belongs, which is the northern East Sudanic branch of the Nilo-Saharan family. That sounds technical. What it means practically is that Meroitic finally has relatives, and living relatives can be used to attack a dead language from the side. It is the oldest written language in sub-Saharan Africa, and for the first time there is a realistic root into it, which leaves the collapse of Kush in a position that no other collapse of this scale occupies. Everything I have shown you today, the teeth, the sinuses, the livestock tally on a foreign king's monument, is a workaround. Every one of them is an attempt to answer a question by going around the people who lived it, because we cannot ask them directly. They are talking. We cannot hear. And they did not vanish. That is the last thing worth being clear about. The successor states form immediately. The territory does not empty, it fragments, and within 2 centuries the same ground is held by Christian kingdoms whose populations descend from the same people. When those kingdoms developed the old Nubian alphabet, they carried 3 Meroitic signs forward into it, from a script they had otherwise stopped using. The writing outlived the state. The people outlived both. What ended was not a population, it was an arrangement. And the ground where all of this sits is in trouble right now, as I make this. Since April of 2023, Sudan has been at war. UNESCO reports more than 100 cultural sites damaged and at least 22 museums looted or destroyed. Galia Gar al-Nabi, who directs the National Antiquities Authority, has stated that more than 60% of the National Museum's holdings were taken, including gold and jewelry belonging to the kings of Napata and Meroe. Naka and Musawarat as Sufra are both considered at risk. At Meroe itself, all preservation work has stopped. Mahmoud Suleiman, the archaeologist who manages the site, has warned publicly that collapses are possible. One of the guards there, Mustafa Ahmed, describes what is happening on the ground in the plainest possible terms. The sand has thickened heavily on the pyramids and inside the temples. The grass is growing thick. The same sand that preserved everything we have is now the thing taking it away. Go back to the head under the step. Face down in the dark, the glass and calcite eyes still set in it, waiting 1900 years for the next sandal that never came. The kingdom that buried it was not beaten by anything stronger. Stronger had already come and gone home with terms. It spent 4 centuries quietly renegotiating its arrangement with a river that kept offering worse ones, until the day the arrangement was no longer worth a capital city, and the army that gets the credit turned up to count sheep. We keep asking who ended Kush because we want a collapse to have a culprit. Kush is the case that says it usually does not. It has a slope and a generation standing on it, and nobody notices the ground moving until the last people who could have told us are buried in a script we can still pronounce and no longer understand.